Okay, so this is the craziest Mercury retrograde of 2025, which is saying a lot because earlier this year in April, we had a pretty crazy Mercury retrograde in Aries into Pisces. It was on top of Saturn and Neptune during eclipse season. But what I think makes this Mercury retrograde crazier than earlier this year is the fact that this is probably the best and the worst Mercury retrograde of the year, and I want to explain why. So in this video, we're going to be covering what you can do with this energy, what you shouldn't be doing with this energy, and of course, at the end, I'll be going over how it's going to be affecting each one of your zodiac signs. And if you don't know me already, my name is Cam Wyatt. I'm a professional astrologer. I've been doing this for a decade, and my job is to tell you what is going on in the universe and how to use it to your advantage so you don't fuck up and you can actually get ahead. So let's go ahead and get started talking about it. So the basics are Mercury's going to station retrograde at 6 degrees Sagittarius on November 9th, and it will retrograde back into Scorpio, where it's going to station direct on November 29th at 20 degrees Scorpio. So number one, if you have any planets in this area of your chart, this is probably going to affect you more. As well, if you have any planets between 0 and 6 degrees of the mutable signs, so Gemini, Virgo, Pisces, or Sagittarius, or if you have any planets between 29 degrees and 20 degrees of the fixed signs. So that's going to be Leo, Taurus, Scorpio, and Aquarius. This Mercury retrograde will be either conjoining, squaring, or going opposite one of those planets in your birth chart. So this might affect you a little bit more. And if you want an idea about what's going on right now and how this Mercury retrograde is going to affect you, I want you to think about October 20th. What was going on October 20th for you? Because that was the day Mercury entered shadow. Now, just before that day, Mercury had conjoined Mars in Scorpio. And Mercury-Mars conjunctions are about fights, conflicts. I even talked about thievery being a big theme of this month over on my website. And it was just after that, the Laveau, the Lavier, whatever that French or Paris art museum got robbed. Pardon my French, I don't know how to speak it. But think back to October 20th and what was going on for you during that time, or what kind of communications or conversations happened during that time. Because Mercury entering shadow is when all of the themes around the Mercury retrograde start to begin. Then as Mercury goes throughout Scorpio, it will then go into Sagittarius on October 29th. Now, the issue with this part of it is Mercury is in detriment in Sagittarius. Mercury is all about communication and logistics and your mindset and your thoughts. And Mercury is all about being like rational, right? But Sagittarius, well, that's Jupiter's house. And Jupiter is all about being abundant and hopeful and faithful. And so Mercury doesn't do all that well in Sagittarius. Mercury can kind of speak without a filter. Mercury can kind of be a little bit irrational. Mercury can struggle with communication during this time. And so as Mercury goes into Sagittarius, it will also immediately go opposite Uranus. Uranus is all about liberation, freedom, chaos, and the unexpected. And oppositions are like a standoff between two planets. Note, Uranus is also in Gemini during this time. So Uranus is in Mercury's house. And so on Wednesday, Mercury going opposite Uranus is some sort of major disruption going on. Maybe saying things a little bit too unfiltered, maybe someone popping off a little bit, or some sort of unexpected event that kind of foils your plans a little bit. This is a really key part of this Mercury retrograde. So as Mercury continues to be in detriment and in shadow, it finally stations retrograde on November 9th. And this is where I want to start talking about the difference of this Mercury retrograde being bad and good. A few days after Mercury stations retrograde on November 12th, Mercury is going to conjoin Mars. So like I said, when Mercury entered shadow, it was conjoining Mars. And as Mercury stationed retrograde, it is also going to conjoin Mars. Mars is fights and conflicts and energy and drive. Now, this time Mars is in Sagittarius, so it's much more ambitious and driven. But as Mercury is retrograde conjoining Mars, this is kind of haphazardly causing some conflicts, haphazardly saying things you didn't necessarily mean just to kind of piss someone off, or someone saying something to you that kind of pisses you off. This is going to be really frustrating. And the big thing I want to talk about with Mercury in Sagittarius is Mercury being about logic and rationality. It's in the sign of abundance, and Jupiter and Mercury are directly opposite one another. They rule completely different parts of the zodiac, opposite parts of the zodiac. And so with Mercury in Sagittarius, you have to kind of let go of rationality and logic in order to somewhat be abundant. And that's going to be the main struggle. As Mercury conjoins Mars while it's now retrograde, there's going to be this frustrating moment of being like, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure what's going on for me. And you're going to be kind of left questioning a lot of things. But that brings us to November 18th. Mercury is going to retrogress back into Scorpio. Now, here's the thing with Mercury and Scorpio. I didn't say this before, but as Mercury entered shadow in Scorpio, it made a trine to Jupiter in Cancer. It made a trine to Saturn in Pisces. It made a trine to Neptune in Pisces. And we got this grand trine energy going on where it's all these planets in the water sign. So there's a lot of like emotional healing and just kind of a lot of focus on your emotions. And as Mercury goes back into Scorpio, we come back to this emotional situation. But as Mercury retrogresses back into Scorpio, something happened the day before Mercury stationed retrograde, and that was Uranus, the planet of chaos and liberation and freedom, retrogressed back into Taurus. And as Mercury goes retrograde and goes back into Scorpio, it will immediately go opposite Uranus again. But this time, instead of in Sagittarius and Gemini, it's in Scorpio and Taurus. Now we come back to like this theme of disruption. But Mercury in Scorpio, Mercury's all about communication and logistics, right? But in Scorpio, it's about like deep, dark truths. As Mercury's kind of plunging into Scorpio and it goes opposite Uranus, you're going to somewhat discover something that might be a little bit unsettling or that might kind of cause a big shakeup. Uranus is about liberation, freedom, and chaos, right? And it does pretty well in Gemini. But in Taurus, Taurus is a fixed sign of value and consistency, and it doesn't really like being shooken up. And so as Mercury goes back into Scorpio and goes opposite Uranus, there's going to be a moment where there's this kind of like unexpected truth coming to the forefront, some sort of unexpected revelation that could kind of disrupt you in a really big way. But here's the thing. The very next day on November 19th, we will have the Mercury retrograde cazimi. And that is when Mercury goes in between the sun and the earth. And the term cazimi essentially stands for being pierced by the heart of the sun, which essentially means being purified and refreshed. This is the halfway point of the Mercury retrograde phase. And this is the point where you start understanding what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what the solution is. Because as Mercury goes through shadow, you start seeing the themes of the problems build up. As Mercury stations retrograde, the problems make themselves aware. And as Mercury goes cazimi, this is when you start figuring out the solutions around the problems. But the special thing about November 19th, I've been doing astrology for a decade now. I've never seen this. When Mercury conjoins the sun is also the exact moment of the new moon in Scorpio. So we're going to have Mercury and the moon and the sun all align at 28 degrees Scorpio. This is pretty interesting to me. Like I said, I've never seen this before, which says a lot. Like I've seen a lot of transits and stuff like that. And, a lot of astrologers say like, this is special. This is special. 9 times out of 10, whatever they're talking about isn't all that special. This is special. And we all know what a new moon is, right? It's lower energy. It's a time to reset. It's a time to cleanse. And this is in Scorpio, so it's like purging out the deep gunk, resetting some deep intentions. I think about Scorpio as like really digging into the roots. And at the same time that we have the Mercury retrograde cazimi. And I really think on November 19th, there's this energy of just having clarity around what the problem is on an internal level. What needs to be purged out? What needs to get cleansed out? And this is Scorpio. We're talking about fear. We're talking about pain. We're talking about trauma. And if you look at the ruler of Scorpio, it's Mars in Sagittarius. Mars in Sagittarius wants freedom. It wants adventure. But all of these themes in Scorpio are talking about being held back by like some deep emotional pain that's going on. But this is where it gets good. As Mercury has this cazimi in Scorpio, and one of the themes I've talked about with this month is like a deep therapy session around like trauma and purging it all out. And after that Mercury retrograde cazimi, Mercury is going to trine Saturn and Jupiter again. So we come back to this grand water trine. And so this is what I want to talk about real fast. When Mercury was in shadow in Scorpio, we're a little bit fixated on our deeper, darker emotions and really kind of focused on one thing. And it trines Jupiter and it trines Saturn. There's some sort of level of emotional awareness that happens here. And maybe with Jupiter and Cancer, there's a little bit of emotional healing. And with Saturn and Pisces, there's a little bit of understanding what your boundaries are and where maybe you're a little bit held back or withdrawn when it comes to expressing emotion or feeling safe or expressing things like empathy. And as Mercury goes into Sagittarius, where it's just kind of like not sure what to believe or think, it goes retrograde, it conjoins Mars. There's all these, problems that come up when it comes to lack of faith or lack of belief. Mercury comes back into Scorpio, conjoins the sun on the new moon. This is an intervention with the universe, essentially. And then it starts to trine Jupiter and Saturn again, as well as Neptune. And this all happens between November 18th and November 22nd. So there's just like a lot of like focus on like our emotions and what we're feeling and how do we release these emotions and how do we not get our mind so fixated on the dark stuff and how do we release that and let that go and transmute that energy. And so this is why I was saying this Mercury retrograde is both the best and the worst. And that's because it's the worst because it's going to station retrograde and detriment on top of Mars. That's going to be a lot of fights and conflicts. It's going to go opposite Uranus multiple times. There's a lot of disruption. But I think it's one of the best because as Mercury goes back into Scorpio and it trines Jupiter and it trines Saturn, it kind of needs to be disrupted. Your life needs to get shaken up a little bit because there's something for you to address. Something I talk a lot about in astrology is these transits wouldn't be happening if they didn't need to happen. And so use this time to get more in depth with your emotions, to purge out some thoughts that aren't helping you anymore, purge out some emotions that you need to let go of because it's holding you back. And then, of course, right before Mercury stations direct, Mercury will also conjoin Venus in Scorpio. So during this whole time, Venus is in Scorpio, which is about love, connection, fun, and pleasure, but she's in detriment. So there's this kind of like not feeling yourself a little bit. Things that are usually pleasurable are a little bit not. You're being a little bit of a bad girl. Also, too, if there was ever a time your ex was going to text you during this Mercury retrograde, I would probably say it's when Mercury is retrograde on top of Venus in Scorpio, because that's some down bad energy. And if you really want to understand everything there is to know about relationships in astrology, I just launched my Real Relationship Astrology 4-week live course. Did you know that 81% of millennials that use astrology use it for love and relationships, and that 73% of Gen Z who uses astrology trust astrology more for love and relationships more than science? And the big thing is, most of you guys don't actually know what you're doing. You look at your 7th house, you look at your Venus, and you try to make sense of it, and it's not all connecting. I've been doing astrology for a decade. I've seen thousands of clients, and I've accurately predicted when people get into relationships, when people get married, when people get pregnant. I've predicted like 20 pregnancies, both planned and unplanned. And in this 4-week live course, I'm going to teach you everything there is to know so you can know when you're going to be getting in a relationship, maybe if it's time to get out of a relationship, how to be a better partner in your relationships, and how to be a better version of yourself to attract the right partnerships. Because there's so much more to relationships in astrology than just your 7th house or just your Venus sign. And I'm going to be covering everything there is to know about this in this 4-week live course. So if you're interested in that, click the link in the description, and the link will also be in the pinned comment. And this is something I'm super excited for because I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been thinking a lot about this for like a year. And it's one of my favorite things to address with clients because it's one of their biggest pain points is their relationships, or lack thereof, and they want to know when it's going to happen, and then I help them figure that out. And if you're interested in things like synastry charts and composite charts, I'm also going to be going in depth into those so you guys can actually understand it for yourself and essentially be your own relationship astrologer. So Mercury retrograde on top of Venus might be a moment where your ex texts you or you text your ex. My only comment on that is maybe this isn't the best energy for that, but Mercury conjoining Venus is at least being able to recognize what you don't like anymore. Now, the other part with Venus and Scorpio is Venus is about pleasure and fun, but she's in detriment, in the sign of like pain. And Venus in Scorpio has a lot to do with like going without pleasure or enjoying things that are typically unpleasurable. And I think Mercury conjoining Venus while it's still retrograde is kind of like after that deep therapy session where you're crying and it's a little bit painful and raw, you feel good though. That's like what this is. Then on November 29th, just a few days later, Mercury stations direct. And as it stations direct at 20 degrees Scorpio, it's going to go through that shadow phase again. And it won't leave shadow until December 16th when it hits 6 degrees Sagittarius. And again, let me remind you, between that time Mercury stations direct and goes through shadow and leaves shadow, Mercury is going to trine Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Pisces, Neptune in Pisces again. So we're going to come back to this theme around healing some emotional stuff, feeling a little bit more clear about what we need to work on. Mercury in Scorpio is a little bit more fixated, again, on deeper, darker emotions, but post-retrograde, it's going to be about looking at what the pain point is and actually being able to know what to do with that energy and how to transmute it. And that's going to be specific for your zodiac sign. Then once Mercury leaves shadow on December 16th, that's when we're all done with this. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and start talking about how this is going to affect your rising sign. Now, again, watch this for your rising sign. Yes, you can watch it for your sun sign, but this is mostly directed towards your rising sign. So for the Aries risings, Mercury is going to be retrograding in your 9th house of spirituality, religion, belief, and far distance travel. And it will retrogress back into your 8th house of other people's money, shared resources, death, debt, and inheritance. So a lot of this Mercury retrograde is going to be like kind of having some conflicts about your beliefs and your worldview. And it's going to come back into your 8th house where, yes, there is a little bit more focus on other people's resources, other people's money. There might be some delays and conflicts there, especially as Mercury goes opposite Uranus in your 2nd house of money. But because Jupiter's in your 4th, Saturn's in your 12th, this is really kind of like getting to some shit and some information around emotions that like maybe you haven't seen or processed. A lot of this might have to do with other people in your life and not necessarily you. But as Mercury goes retrograde in your 9th house of travel and Mercury rules over your 6th house of work and labor, there might be some delays in travel. But I would really argue that this is going to be a time of like just being really frustrated with your belief and your lack of faith. And you might have to go a little bit more deep down into yourself to kind of purge out some hidden things that are kind of, holding you back. For the Taurus risings, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde in your 8th house of other people's money, shared resources, death, debt, and inheritance in Sagittarius. and it will be going back into your 7th house of relationships. This is all about relationships for you guys, especially if you are in one, and Mercury retrograding in your 8th house will be dealing with your partner's money, your partner's finances, and there will be some delays and miscommunications in that area, especially as Mercury goes opposite Uranus and Gemini in your 2nd house of money. And as Mercury comes back into your 7th house of relationships, this is kind of figuring out what's going on with relationships for you guys, what's going on in the way that you guys communicate. Because Saturn's in your 11th house and Jupiter's in your 3rd house, this is really focused on all types of relationships. There's going to be more focus on one individual relationship, probably more focus on love and romance, but there's a lot of assistance and support from your community, from your friends, from extended family members. But all of this is about really addressing some underlying deep issues within your relationship and just being honest and kind of confronting whatever the thing that's kind of hidden and dark and bringing it up to the surface. For the Gemini risings, Mercury is stationing retrograde in your 7th house of relationships, and it will retrogress back into your 6th house of work, labor, health, routines, day-to-day activities, and even pets. Because Mercury is the ruler of your ascendant and it's in detriment your 7th house of relationships, this is all about relationships and more in particular to you in general. This is going to be about getting in some sort of conflict with a relationship. It could possibly be with a friend or with a coworker because Mars rules your 11th house of friends and your 7th house and your 6th house of coworkers. However, if you're in a relationship, and this will kind of bring that up too, some fights, some arguments. But as Mercury comes back into your 6th house, this is going to be like readdressing and rescheduling and reorganizing your habits, your routines. This can bring up some sickness and illness. So like maybe you're just sick for a little while and it's kind of got you down. But as Mercury's back in your 6th house too, this is going to be a big focus on like, what are the habits and routines that are kind of keeping you away from everything? Jupiter is in your 2nd house of money and Saturn's in your 10th house of career. So this is a big time about work. And yes, this Mercury retrograde is about relationships, but there's a lot about work that's going on here too. And that's why I was thinking this might be more of a work relationship, whether it's a manager, a boss, a coworker, and there might be some fixes and changes around your schedule, or possibly even changing jobs too. For the Cancer risings, Mercury is retrograding in your 6th house of work, labor, health, and routines, as well as pets, and it will retrogress back into your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, art, music, recreation, and children. Now, as Mercury stations retrograde in your 6th house of work and labor, this might be a time where you get maybe a little bit sick or you have some issues or delays with your job. But as Mercury comes back into your 5th house, what's really interesting about this is the 5th house is all about love and fun and pleasure and like self-expression. And as Mercury comes back into your 5th house, this is going to be a big focus on like, what do you actually want? What do you actually desire? Especially when it comes to any sort of creative things that you do in your job. Mars rules your 5th house of creativity. It is now in your 6th house of work, health, and habits. So this can bring up even like health issues around sex, or this can bring up some miscommunication, some delays, or even rethinking the way that you do your creative stuff, the way that you do any sort of your art or your music, and how you put that into your schedule and your routine. If you have kids, this will be the same thing, like miscommunication with your kids. That kind of brings up some delays and problems with your schedule and your routines. But as Mercury trines Jupiter in your 1st house and Saturn in your 9th house, there's a lot of spiritual connection to be like, what am I doing? Who am I? Why am I doing this? But it really kind of gets boiled down to like, you need to be expressing yourself a little bit more and actually doing something fun and creative. For the Leo risings, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde in your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, art, music, recreation, and children. And it will retrogress back into your 4th house of home and family and living situation. Mercury rules your 2nd house of money, and it's retrograding in your 5th house of like fun, kids. And so there's going to be some like delays and miscommunications and problems with like either sex or love, or even just like having fun. If you have kids, there's probably going to be some like arguments or like issues around kids, especially with money. But as Mercury comes back into your 4th house of like home and family and living situation, this is really readdressing like your actual personal space. Jupiter is in your 12th house of isolation, and Saturn's in your 8th house of like death and other people's resources. And whenever I see trines in like the 8th and the 12th and the 4th, is like really connecting to some like deep shit, but also carving out, this is a big theme for the Leo risings anyways, like carving out sanctuary space and like alone time and privacy. And I think as Mercury comes back into Scorpio in your 4th house, there's going to be some miscommunications and problems related to your parents, your family, your living situation. And so this will be kind of a frustrating one, but as Mercury goes into Scorpio, there's a lot of focus on your home and your family. And Scorpio, it's like pain and trauma and like having to like purge things out. But I think you're ready to kind of address some things here and start healing it anyway. For the Virgo risings, Mercury is stationing retrograde in your 4th house of home and family and living situation and parents. And it's going to be retrogressing back into your 3rd house of short distance travel, communication, siblings, and neighbors. Mercury is your ascendant ruler, so it's going to be much more important for you. Whatever Mercury's doing is going to be much more important for you anyway, and it's going to be stationing retrograde in detriment in your fourth house of home and family and living situation. So there might be some miscommunication with your parents, some sort of delay or problem with your home or your living situation. Mercury also rules your 10th house of career, so this might even bring up problems with like work or career because of the living situation or home stuff. And as it retrogresses back into your third house, the third house rules a lot of different things. One of them is going to be like, how do you use your free time? Another is like, how do you actually communicate? Your siblings, your neighbors, people close to you. And this is going to be really like talking to these people or getting a little bit closer to that and kind of really focusing on like, where do you spend your free time? What are you really focusing your energy on? Saturn's in your 7th house of relationships and Jupiter's in your 11th house of friends too. So there's a lot of support with your networks and your friends and the people around you. But I think with Mercury and Scorpio in your 3rd house, this might just be rethinking, what do you say to them and why do you say these things? For the Libra risings, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde in your 3rd house of short distance travel, neighbors, siblings, using your free time, and it's going to retrogress back into your 2nd house of money, finances, and resources. So as Mercury goes retrograde in your 3rd house, there's going to be some sort of a miscommunication or a problem or a conflict related to your neighbors, your siblings, or the 3rd house also rules cars. Mercury can rule cars and Mars can rule vehicles too. So there's a lot of focus on like cars and vehicles during this time. So there could be some issues around that, having to travel a lot because it rules short distance travel and having some delays in your plans because of all that travel. And then Mercury is going to retrogress back into your 2nd house of money, finances, and resources, where Jupiter's in your 10th house of career and Saturn's in your 6th house of work. There's a lot of really good things going on with your career and your work right now, but Mercury retrograde in your 2nd house is like, well, what are the actual issues with money? Are you like making plenty of money but spending it? Do you need to make more money? This is a great time to actually excel in your career right now. So really take advantage of this time. But Mercury retrograde in Scorpio could just be a big focus on like, what are your beliefs about money? Do you feel weird about making more money? Do you need to kind of get rid of that in order to make more money, in order to grow into the area, to the career that you want to grow into? For the Scorpio risings, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde in your 2nd house of money, finances, and resources. And then it's going to retrogress back into your 1st house of you, yourself, your personality, and your body. As Mercury stations retrograde in your 2nd house of money, there's going to be some delays, miscommunications, unexpected bills coming up. That's probably going to be a big one. And that's going to cause you, and again, Mars is also your ascendant ruler and it's in your 2nd house of money. You're going to be burning through cash. There's just going to be like a lot of like many things moving really fast with finances. But as Mercury goes back into your 1st house of you, yourself, there's going to be this big focus on like, how are you going to address this? Who are you? And like, who do you need to become in order to understand this a little bit better? Mercury retrograding in Scorpio might bring up some fears around this stuff related to you and how you address it. But this is really about purging all of this stuff out. Saturn's in your 5th house of self-expression and Jupiter's in your 9th house of beliefs. So this is really a big time of like, if you feel any sort of fear or scarcity, you got to kind of lock in with yourself and like get rid of that and purge out that fear. For the Sagittarius risings, Mercury is stationing retrograde in your 1st house of yourself, your body, your image, your looks, and it's going to retrogress back into your 12th house of isolation, alienation, hidden enemies, the subconscious, and fears and phobias. Now, Mercury rules your 7th house of relationships and your 10th house of career. It's retrograding your 1st house of you. There's a good chance you might miscommunicate something. You might change your mind about something. And there might just be some fights and conflicts around relationships and career. And Mercury just stationing in your 1st house anyway, it's just like you miscommunicating something or there being a big miscommunication or delay with relationships and work. But as Mercury goes back into your 12th house of like the subconscious, like your actual like unconscious mind and isolation, there's a lot of purging happening here. Jupiter's in your 8th house of like the occult and secrets and death and hidden things. And Saturn's in your 4th house of like your home and your family. And the 12th house is all about like isolation and privacy. And when you see these trines happening in the 8th and the 12th and the 4th, these are all hidden houses. They're all like, dark and not something that's always visible. There's a lot of like background stuff that is going on emotionally for you that you're working on purging out and cleansing out. And it will be a little bit rough, but this is definitely like the deep trauma therapy session for you guys. For the Capricorn risings, Mercury is stationing retrograde in your 12th house of isolation, alienation, the subconscious, fears, phobias, repressed parts of yourself. And Mercury will retrogress back into your 11th house of friendships, community, and networks. As Mercury stations retrograde in your 12th house, you might be a little bit lost in your mind and a little bit overwhelmed with everything that's going on. There might just be like, you're just really wrapped up in your head and really alone for like just a second. And I think that might kind of like fuck with you. But as Mercury comes back into Scorpio in your 11th house of friends, this is really about connecting with people. Jupiter's in your 7th house of relationships. Saturn's in your 3rd house of like people that are relatively like actually close to you. And as Mercury goes back into your 11th house of friends, it's like, do you reach out to friends? Do you communicate with friends? This might be like a falling out of a friendship or some sort of a miscommunication or a fight or a conflict with a friend. Maybe someone kind of, fucks you over in some sort of way. But a lot of this is going to be kind of readdressing your friendships and who are you around and do you communicate to them clearly? Do you trust them? And do you need to purge things out, or do you need to actually reach out more to the people that you have in your circle for support? For the Aquarius risings, Mercury is stationing retrograde in your 11th house of friends, community, and networks, and it will retrogress back into your 10th house of career, reputation, and legacy. As Mercury stations retrograde in your 11th house of like friends and community, there's going to be some sort of miscommunication or problem or fight or conflict with friends related to work. And that's because Mercury is going to station on Mars. Mars rules your 10th house of career. And you'll have to readdress this as Mercury comes back into your 10th house of career. Saturn's in your 2nd house of money. Jupiter's in your 6th house of work and labor. So this is an excellent time to like get ahead with work, but this will be like having to like really lock it in and focus and kind of get rid of and cut out any of the things that are holding you back and just focus on one thing. Mercury retrograde is going to bring up some delays with work, and this will bring up some problems with work, but this is about purging out any sort of like fears relative to like what you're doing. And for the Pisces risings, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde in your 10th house of work, career, reputation, and legacy. And it's going to be coming back into your 9th house of spirituality, religion, far distance travel, higher education. And as Mercury stations in your 10th house, there's like a delay or some sort of an issue with work and career that feels really frustrating and confusing and like a lack of faith and belief. But as Mercury comes back into Scorpio, like Jupiter's in your 1st house, the water signs in the Pisces risings charts rules the personal houses. So the 1st house of you and your body, the 5th house of how you express yourself, and the 9th house of like how you see the world and what you put out into the world. And so as Mercury retrogresses back into Scorpio and it's back into your 9th house, this is really about like coming back into your spiritual self. Like, hey, there might be some problems with work and career, but like, can you purge out any sort of negative spiritual beliefs that you have around career and success and even things like money? Because this is going to bring up some pain points around that. And it's time to really let go of that because that shit does not serve you anymore. And so if you made it this far, thank you so much for getting to the end of this video. I know most of you watch the rising sign and just kind of, click out after that. But I really wanted to appreciate you guys watching this. If you let me know in the comments below what your rising sign is and what you're dealing with and how you think you're going to go about it this month. And like I said, I think this Mercury retrograde is both some of the best and the worst. I think it's the worst because it's going to bring up a lot of issues, but I think it's the best because this is the best time to actually address these issues once and for all. And like I said, join the 4-week live course that we're doing about relationships. You guys are going to get everything that I have learned over 10 years doing consultations, making accurate predictions when it comes to people getting in relationships, getting out of relationships, and figuring out how to be a better partner based on your chart, as well as synastry, composite, all of it. You're going to get all of it. Sign up for that with the link below, and I'll be seeing you guys over there.